Hey, good morning, Anakin. Mrs. Clark had asked me if I would film another sort of lecture video for you for the second section of Chapter 12. The first section kind of covered how the war got started and the first battle, the Battle of Manassas. The second section sort of continues on with the war. This first section begins with sort of the strategy of the two sides and sort of how people lived with being in a country at war. This first slide here sort of looks at the northern strategy or Abraham Lincoln strategy and the southern strategy. First off, as far as how they're both going to win the war, both sides are going to try to win the war differently. Abraham Lincoln in the North had three real goals. The first was to capture the southern capital of Richmond, Virginia, this city right here. That city was vital to capturing. They also wanted to gain the control of the Mississippi River right here. They felt that the Mississippi River was going to be extremely important because if they could control the Mississippi River, then the South couldn't ship goods and weapons and men up and down the river. And then lastly, they wanted a naval blockade. Basically, just have a bunch of naval vessels, like boats, that were going to block off southern cities and ports from the world so that southern boats couldn't go to other cities, they couldn't move troops, they couldn't move guns, they couldn't move supplies, they couldn't buy things from foreign countries, they couldn't sell things to foreign countries. Abraham Lincoln, with those three plans, would call this his anaconda plan. All an anaconda is a big old, like, constricting snake that wraps itself around things and then slowly chokes it to death. Abraham Lincoln viewed the Union Army as pretty much as just being this gigantic anaconda that was going to wrap itself completely around the South and was going to slowly strangle the South to death. The Southern strategy was a little bit different. Kind of like with the North, where they wanted to capture the Southern capital city. The first goal was they wanted to capture Washington, D.C., which was right about, where are we at here? Oh, right about here or so. So they wanted to capture Washington, D.C. Secondly, they wanted to invade somewhere in the north. The goal was to invade somewhere in Maryland up here, or see if they could get up into Pennsylvania. The goal of that was to shake northern morale, make northern citizens scared and worried that the war was coming to them. And then lastly, they felt that they needed to win the support of the English or the French, that they had to get England or France to take their side. They felt that they had to get their cotton and their tobacco to those countries. And that was extremely important to them. Ultimately, they're going to end up failing in that because France ends up getting into a war with Mexico and gets a little busy, and England finds other places to buy their tobacco and buy their cotton. Particularly, they're finding a lot of it from India. So they're going to eventually fail in that regard. The next slide, the computer's going slow. There. Just sort of looks at the men, the soldiers themselves, and what the military experience was like. The Confederate soldiers here were typically characterized by wearing gray. The rebels, they would wear gray uniforms, and the Union soldiers or the Northern soldiers would be wearing the blue soldiers. So it typically ended up being blue versus gray. Even though there was oftentimes no standard uniforms at first. Sometimes they would all be wearing the same uniforms. At the beginning of the war, most soldiers were excited about the war. They saw this as an adventure that would quickly wear off. There'd be massive food, clothing, and gun shortages amongst both militaries. The South would lack good boots and warm coats for their soldiers, and poor sanitation. Basically, um, disease will run rampant throughout both sides' military camps. Food would oftentimes spoil. Hospitals had very few supplies. Thousands will die of preventable diseases like the flu or pneumonia. And surgeries are oftentimes done without pain medications. The old phrase of biting down onto a bullet, that would come from, like, if a soldier had a bullet lodged into his arm, there'd be no pain medication for the doctor to inject and then rip the bullet out. So the doctor would give him like a bullet, and he would just bite onto the bullet while the doctor rips out the bullet from his body. Minor injuries would oftentimes lead to infections and death. In fact, most death in the Civil War wasn't caused by battle itself. It was caused by disease, infection, and people starving to death or malnutrition. And probably some of the worst conditions were in POW camps, or prisoner of war camps. One of the worst was in Andersonville, Georgia, where it was estimated 100 Union soldiers were dying every day from disease, malnourishment, and infection. So, as far as people living in homes, like just everyday average people, there was a huge reliance on women, children, and old people to pick up the slack at home. Thousands upon thousands of able-bodied men are off fighting on both sides. So they're sort of picking up the slack in factories and in farms and taking over work roles. Volunteer groups pop up all over the place trying to make bandages, clothing, food. We see that right now with what we're going through, is like volunteer groups popping up to make face masks, to make sure that we all have enough face masks. So volunteer groups weren't uncommon. Parades would be organized to try to make people feel better, get young men to volunteer to fight. Fundraisers would be held, helped by guns, uniforms, and quite frankly, both sides' economies were hurt badly, but the Southern economy was really, really hurt bad, especially by that naval blockade. This slide here, looking at this, one of the most famous women that would come out of the Civil War would be this woman here, Clara Barton. I don't know if my mouse is highlighting her at all. She would become one of the founding members of the American Red Cross, which still exists today. There are numerous stories of women, oftentimes dressing up as men, wanting to go and fight in the Civil War. There are many known cases of women playing the role of spies as well, spying on both sides. The first female doctor the first female doctor in American history is going to come out of the Civil War. Her name was Elizabeth Blackwell. She's the first female medical doctor, and she's going to run the U.S. Sanitary Commission for the U.S. government. And then last, I got Clara Barton here. She was just a battlefield, I shouldn't say just a battlefield nurse. She was a battlefield nurse who would help found the American Red Cross after the Civil War. Quite frankly, the only group of women that were pretty much accepted by both the North and the South were Catholic nuns. They would oftentimes create emergency hospitals, and they didn't care which side they would make the hospital for. They would welcome Northern soldiers, Southern soldiers, so it wasn't uncommon for them to go to a battlefield site, set up a temporary hospital, and they would treat Northern soldiers and Southern soldiers. And both sides would allow them to do this, which is not normal in war. The war itself was not always popular with a lot of people. In the South, at first, it was popular, but as the war dragged on, more and more people started questioning it, especially amongst poor Southern whites, because this war is being fought over slavery, the right of white people to own black people. Most people in the South, though, didn't own slaves. Most people in the South were poor. And if you're a poor white man who couldn't own a slave, not because you didn't want one, just because you couldn't afford one, you're fighting and possibly dying for the right of a wealthy man to buy and own a slave. That mentality is actually going to start making a lot of Southern whites upset, feeling as if they don't feel as if it's right for them to be putting their life on the line for a rich person to get richer. So that's going to be a real problem. I have this note here, and in the spring of 1862, the rebels, or the South, they're going to have the first conscription law, or the first draft in American history. After this, we're going to see numerous drafts throughout American history. All that is being forced to join the military. And that creates the argument over, is it fair to force people to fight, especially if they don't want to. In the North, they're going to have conscription laws as well. There are going to be a lot of people who are unhappy with being forced to fight, especially for the freedom of black people. And there are a number of sympathizers in the North for the South. They would actually be given the nickname of the Copperheads. Copperheads are poisonous snakes, but if you study copperheads, these are snakes that just sort of like hide and disguise themselves in the underbrush, and you can't really see it till it's too late, and then it comes out and lashes at you and bites you, and then you're dead. In the North, we would refer to these Southern sympathizers as Copperheads because you couldn't necessarily tell who they were, but you knew that they were around you, and they could be deadly because you never knew what it was that they were capable of. That's about it. I know I kind of skipped over a few things, but I feel as if I went over the bulk of most of this section. So, talk to you later, Anakin.